We, thine unworthy servants, here gathered together in thy name, do most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and guide us in all our consultations. And grant that, we having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsels may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace, and tranquility of the island, and the uniting and knitting together of the hearts of all persons and estates within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
This Honorable Senate is called to order on Friday, September 24 in the year 2021. Senator Hill, I recognize you from a seat other than your own. You, no doubt, members would have observed that we returned after the recess last week Friday, and I was absent, so I crave your indulgence just to make a few comments. First of all, to welcome you all back from the summer recess. I know that Senator Sinclair would have done so, but as I said, I'm asking for your indulgence to just permit me to welcome you back. Just to say that we have managed to do quite a bit of work in the last last term. Hopefully we'll get through some critical legislation that I understand that is coming, and also that we can complete the State of the Nation debate, which in fact continues today. I must say that I was of the view that towards the end of last term, and I do not exclude myself from the observation, we had reached a point where I thought some of the language that we were using was what is referred to in the parliamentary legislations as being unparliamentary. And I'm going to ask that we all try and just rededicate ourselves to a better standard of debate, because you may be surprised to know how many people observe our meetings and take a cue from us. I think at a time when the nation is in a somber and perhaps pensive mood in view of the pandemic, which continues to cause great difficulty in terms of the health of the nation and indeed in terms of the economy of the nation. I do believe that we owe it to the country to elevate our debate and to elevate our behavior. As I said, I do not exclude myself from the observations. It is my intention to maintain the sort of order that I believe the country demands from us. And you can consider this an appeal for us to lift the level of our behavior. But I will, in the coming months, if necessary, use the standing orders to enforce order in this place. I think we owe it to the people of Jamaica, and we owe it to this country, Jamaica, land we love. Permit me also, and I know that this was done, to congratulate the newly appointed Clerk of the House, Ms. Valerie Curtis, who has given sterling service to the nation in this parliament. I know the tongue of good report has been spoken in her favor already, but I just, from my point of view, Ms. Curtis, thank you for all that you have done for us. And I know Senator Morris, you have been extremely helpful to Senator Morris when he was president, and you continue to be of great assistance to us all. I will say as well that it is my intention to have a specific day when we as a Senate can pay our respects and gratitude to Heather Cook, former Clerk of the House, and I'm going to set a specific day when I can invite Ms. Cook down so that we can tell her in person our feelings. Again, it was done on the last occasion, but I have to place on record my condolences to Senator K.D. Knight on the passing of his wife and illness of his daughter Stacy, and let him know that certainly from my point of view, he is in the prayers of my family. I must also record my personal condolences to the family of Ernest Smith, who has been a friend of mine from 1978 I first met him. So that's a considerable period of time. And of course, the wife of Mr. Davis, former Minister of Finance. His wife was Rose, an accomplished individual in her own right. So I place my personal condolences on the record. I must bring to the attention of the Senate and to offer my personal condolences to our own Senator Natalie Campbell Rodriguez, who quite, I don't even know what the adjective is, but she lost both her grandmother and a cousin yesterday in short period of time. So condolences for myself and my family. And as usual in these things, one can hardly imagine the level of distress that you must be feeling. But we know that you have the capacity, the strength, and the faith to go through this period of time.
Mr. President, thank you for recognizing me for speaking from a seat other than my own. And we're going through very difficult times, and I just want to recognize and add mine and my colleagues' condolences and prayers to our colleague, Senator Natalie Rodriguez, who has established herself as quite a personality in a short period of time in our caucus. It's within hours that her cousin first, and then her grandmother spoke to her this morning, Granny. And we all know what Granny means to so many Jamaicans. Cousins are important, and she was sad, but to have a cousin and a granny pass in the same period of time, in the same day, for the same person, our hearts go out to her. I also know that she would allow me to say, for her and for myself and for so many of us, if you haven't yet had the vaccine, please, the first opportunity you can get, please take the vaccine. It's the really only way we know right now that will reduce the effect of the virus. And it's offered, the encouragement is offered with good faith, without any bit of malice, without saying we know everything, but that it works for many people. So if you have the chance and you haven't yet taken it, take it, and our condolences and heartfelt wishes to our colleague Senator Natalie Rodriguez. God bless you.
Thank you. Senator Scott Motley.
Mr. President, it is a very emotional thing to say to my sister, my condolences. That cannot be an easy journey for someone to walk. To lose your grandmother and your cousin on the same, just hours apart. Our hearts go out to you. And as I said to you earlier, the only difficulty is you can't hug, because Senator Longmore will tell you the power of a hug for comfort. I know that you have been a proponent of vaccination. You are the most careful person in the Parliament with the hand sanitizing and the requirement that everybody keep on their masks. And I don't know why fate would have it this way, that somebody like you would have to experience this kind of loss. I join in with Senator Hill in saying that I hope that persons who know of what has happened to you will understand how important it is to be vaccinated. And that you will use the opportunity, as you have done on other occasions. Now you have this experience to add to it, to tell others, please get vaccinated. You know, we have suffered so much loss. And in the beginning, I must confess, you saw the numbers, but you never felt the numbers. And now it seems as though the numbers are getting so close to you. You know a friend who has a friend. You have a family member. You have somebody who you went to school with, and it's wrapping its arms around you. Please take the vaccine. We have even lost some of our frontline workers, the nurses and the police who we have lost. I have to acknowledge the way in which we have lost them. We extend our condolences to you. We are here. We have our moments when we are locked in adversity and we're battling. But at the end of the day, we are here for you. We are here. If it pleases you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Scott Motley. Senator Rodriguez, you don't have to, but if you wish to respond, you may.
Mr. Chairman, if you'll allow me to speak from a seat that's not my own. Mine has a broken barrier, so I'm here. Let me first just say thank you to everyone. I wasn't sure I was going to come today, but I had to recognize who I am. I do better putting one foot in front of the other and keep moving. I don't know what my colleague psychiatrist would say that says about me, but I have to get lost in whatever while acknowledging my grief. If I stay away, it gets harder. And so I have to say thank you for the kind words, the phone calls, the messages. It helps, and it means a lot to me to know that there is support. And, you know, Senator Scott Motley, you are right, hugs matter. And it's hard. It is painful. That thing that can bring us solace in hard times, we have lost it. Right now, I can only hug my immediate family, and they're also grieving. So, you know, to get that external hug would have been appreciated, and I know you have sent it to me virtually, and I do appreciate it so much. You know, I have been a loud voice for vaccines. I've been a loud voice for us doing what is necessary. And I take this opportunity to once again ask for us to do it, even if not for ourselves, for those most vulnerable around us. Because I can tell you the pain is not easy. And it gets harder because it could have been avoided. So to spare anyone else going through this, I use this opportunity to say, get the vaccine. You don't know what's in your high blood pressure medicine. You don't know what is in the strong back you're buying from the man around the road. So don't give me that argument, please. Let us just do what is necessary. I lived in Rwanda for a few years, and they lost, during the genocide, a large part of their population. They had no anesthesiologists left, no cardiologists, they died out. Let us not allow this pandemic to ravish us and ravish our society. We have seen in the last few weeks so many persons who are vital to the running of our societies and our families gone. So I beseech thee, each and every one, and let us encourage others and keep fighting and keep pushing. Thank you so much, if it pleases you.
Thank you very much, Senator Rodriguez. Statements by ministers. Announcements. Bills brought from the Honorable House of Representatives. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the Senate today are the following. Ministry Paper number 64 of 2021, entitled Annual Report of the Students' Loan Bureau for the year ended March 31, 2018. Annual Report on Audited Financial Statements of the Independence Park Limited for the financial year 2018-2019. Auditor General's Performance Audit Report on Nutrition Products Limited, Governance and Resource Management. Report on Information Security, Governance and Management of the Passport, Immigration and Citizenship Agency. Bank of Jamaica Quarterly Monetary Policy Report, Volume 21, Number 4, dated May 2021, and Bank of Jamaica Quarterly Monetary Policy Report, Volume 22, Number 1, dated August 2021.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Bills brought from the Honorable House of Representatives. Petitions. Papers. Reports from committees. Notices of motions given orally. Questions and answers to questions. Dr. Morris.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to give notice that at the expiration of 21 days, I'll ask the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade the following question tabled in my name. May it please, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Morris. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Notices relating to the sitting of the Senate. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentations of bills without the leave of the Senate first obtained. Public business. Minister Hill.
Mr. President, I'm pleased to indicate that the State of the Nation debate will continue today with contributions from the following of our colleagues. First, Senator Peter Bunting, to be followed by Senator the Honourable Matthew Samuda. Mr. President.
Thank you, Minister Hill. Senator Bunting, I recognize you.
Thank you. Mr. President, when this year's State of the Nation debate opened with two presentations by Senators Don Webby and Janice Allen, I was reminded of the haves and have-not speech that then opposition member of the Legislative Council, Edward Siaga, delivered in the State of the Nation debate on April 21st, 1961. In his autobiography, Mr. Siaga recalled how members of the Legislative Council including representatives of the wealthiest families and biggest business houses in Jamaica, were visibly shaken by his presentation that day, by that haves and have-not speech. 60 years later, I listened to Senator Webby deliver what could be styled as the perspective of the wealthiest families and biggest business houses, while Senator Allen did well in representing the challenges of the have-nots, both in the tourism sector and nationally. Both presentations were accurate, but just presented from two very different perspectives, different paradigms, different worldviews. Mr. President, we still live in a deeply divided country. There are two Jamaicas. One is a beautiful island that is a place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business. The other is a world of poverty, misery, and sometimes squalor, with people struggling to survive, to raise their children in what can be deemed some of the most violent communities in the world, and at the same time protecting these children from the human predators. There are numerous other examples of the two Jamaicas, the haves and the have-nots, and the institutionalized inequality that blights the lives of the have-nots. Just last week, our leading newspaper's front page story was captioned, "Double Standard." And it highlighted the difference in treatment of Dane Mitchell, a resident of Jonestown, who was arrested by police inside his home within a couple hours of posting a social media video directing invectives at the PM and indicating his non-compliance with the DRMA regulations. He was arrested, coerced to apologize, and fined $60,000 for breaches of the DRMA regulations. The story went on to contrast that with the treatment that the persons who appeared in the video, the JLP bigwigs flossing and bruffing, how that was treated by the police. All we've heard so far, almost 2 weeks later, is that the commissioner has passed it to the deputy commissioner, who has passed it to the cyber people, apparently on its way to file 13. Mr. President, the most effective way to destroy all respect for the rule of law is to make it obvious that the law will only be applied to the poor and the powerless. If the elite in this country are filmed boasting about their immunity from the law, the people will see that our society is both deeply unequal and fundamentally unfair. We cannot then expect them to behave as decent, compliant citizens because they have seen their leaders mocking them. I ask you, Mr. President, I ask colleagues, how much the over 2,000 persons arrested and charged by the police and eventually fined for breaches of the DRMA regulations feel when they observe this double standard? Mr. President, just this week, 40 Jamaicans were each fined $200,000 by the St. Thomas Parish Court for breaches of the DRMA. That was either not wearing a mask or being on the road during the curfew period. How do these 40 Jamaicans feel today? Mr. President, $200,000 for somebody who might be earning minimum wage if they're working at all is an enormous penalty. The leader of the opposition pointed to this danger when the 2021 amendment bill was being debated in the House. I reiterated it when we were debating it in the Senate, because the defective way in which the Disaster Risk Management Act was amended by the government makes any breach of the Prime Minister's DRMA orders a criminal offense and liable to a court fine of up to $1 million. The absence of the promised ticketing system, which I recall the Prime Minister saying in March was imminent. February, you're correcting me, thank you. The absence of that promised ticketing system means that the supposed 10 levels of fixed amount fines are not in effect, and these DRMA breaches are taken to court. Mr. President, the JCF was formed in 1867 in response to the Morant Bay Rebellion. It was to protect the interests and assets of the landed plantocracy. They are, of course, a very different organization now, but all their efforts to become a fully modern police service are undermined if many Jamaicans are convinced that a century and a half later, the JCF still operates predominantly to serve the interests of the elites, to include the political elites. 2 months after that young Rasta woman in Zinga King had her hair cut off, allegedly, at the Four Pass police station, not only has been there no report from the various investigations, but the public defender was prevented from visiting the Four Pass station in order to advance her office's investigation of the matter. This is not appropriate behavior. This behavior is undermining the credibility of the JCF. But it's not limited to the JCF, Mr. President. Just recently, this week, the Auditor General reported on the dealings between the Ministry of Education and Nutrition Products Limited. The Auditor General reported that the public body improperly paid $143 million to connected parties. What the spokesman on finance in the lower house referred to as to eat a food. To eat a food. This too, Mr. President, sends a powerful message to the people that politicians put their friends on public boards that become completely corrupt and are used to channel public funds into their own companies and pockets. How can you ask the people to respect the law when they can go to jail for stealing a few dollars, but they see people steal tens of millions of tax dollars and escape all penalty? Mr. President, I'll use my contribution to this debate to highlight some of these profound inequalities, many of which are being exposed and exacerbated by the ravages of the pandemic. I will also evaluate the government's response to the pandemic in the health sector, to the security of our people, and the wider impact on the economy, and conclude with some suggestions that can help reverse the social inequities. So let me start with the COVID impact. Governments did not cause the COVID pandemic, but every government has the responsibility for protecting their people. So it is right and fair to evaluate the performance of any government in how they mitigate the worst ravages of the pandemic and start to build back more resilient economies and societies. At the start of the pandemic, many suggestions were made by the opposition, suggestions aimed at developing a strategic response to counter the long-term impact of the pandemic. In particular, we suggested to separate planning structures, or to create separate planning structures, not in the front line of dealing with the crisis, but focused on designing and implementing longer-term, more strategic responses. So, for example, as then Shadow Minister of Education and Training, as early as April 2020, I called for the establishment of a broad-based task force under the National Council on Education to assess and plan for the long-term impact of COVID-19 on the education sector. Had this recommendation been accepted, it would have helped mitigate the chaos and confusion in the sector over the last 18 months. Mr. President, we have lost 120,000 children who are not in school and not attending online. That's about 30% of the total enrollment. Education is cumulative. Each year builds on the lessons learned last year. Those children who have been lost cannot just catch up later. The chain has been broken, and many of them are lost forever to the school system.
Yes.
They will leave school not only without qualifications, but in many cases uneducated and unemployable. This country will be living with the consequences for decades to come. This disaster could and should have been avoided. We anticipated the normal organizational structures would be overwhelmed in just attempting to manage the short-term tactical response to the pandemic. We anticipated that. Anybody could have anticipated that. Those separate planning structures that we proposed would have taken a more inclusive, a more collaborative, and a more reflective orientation. Regrettably, those calls went unheeded. And 18 months later, we are still in a reactive mode, still in crisis, and nowhere near the end of this nightmare. I'm sorry to say this. I'm sorry to have to say this, but it does appear to me that the approach to problems, whether in health care, security, agriculture, etc., of this Holiness administration always seeks the expedient public relations-driven solutions rather than the principled data-driven solutions. And I understand why. This government has invested in a powerful communications machinery for political purposes and sometimes uses it inappropriately to deal with a genuine national crisis. They've employed a troll army, using state resources to intimidate opposing voices. They have allocated billions of dollars to public relations, sometimes euphemistically called communications or public education, across the various ministries of government. They have used the DRMA regulations and what appears to be its selective enforcement to control dissent. They have used the advantage of numbers in Parliament to often shout over the opposition speakers. And this government seems to pander to the powerful vested interests in the society. So in the short to medium term, such an administration may successfully manufacture consent, influencing traditional and especially social media sentiment in their favor. I think it was Noam Chomsky who wrote a book titled Manufacturing Consent. And it's just about that. But Mr. President, history does not judge leaders and administrations based on their popularity or even their electoral success, but on what they did for their countries. Did they protect their people? Did they improve the lives of their people? These are not matters of perception or social media chatter. These are the true measure of any government, and they can be objectively measured. Any objective assessment of the state of the nation today, however, can only conclude that this administration's management of the pandemic has been poor. There are many examples of serious missteps. The first was calling an election a year early. Politically, shrewd maybe, but it rapidly accelerated the community transmission of the virus in Jamaica. In fact, I recall it was the day after the general election that the public announcement was made that we were now in the community transmission phase. The failure to aggressively plan and pursue vaccine acquisition has left us at the lowest end of per capita vaccinations in the region. Only Haiti below us, and if we can only end up comparing ourselves to Haiti with all the challenges that they're facing now, then we're in a bad place. The relaxation of restrictions in July 2021, when doctors were already warning about the onset of the Delta variant and the third wave of infections. This served to turbocharge the rate of infections and overwhelm the healthcare system. Mr. President, this one is hard to believe, but the government actually laid off over 100 doctors employed to the ministry in the middle of a pandemic with an already overburdened health system. Huge misstep. Just prior to the reopening, or the opening up. This government failed to provide accurate consumption projections to the sole provider of medical oxygen to the Ministry of Health, which resulted in critical oxygen shortages and a number of deaths which the government will not disclose up to now. The over-centralization of testing and vaccinations, which limited the mobilization of private sector resources to fight the pandemic. And finally, the final misstep I want to mention, and this one is a 5-year misstep, and that is the 5-year, Senator Allen, you will relate to this one in particular, the 5-year multi-billion-dollar bungled renovation of Cornwall Regional Hospital. That has left our premier facility in the West in a suboptimal state and placed unnecessary pressure on the West healthcare providers. You could have built an entirely new hospital in the 5 years and a brand new hospital for the money that they've spent. So, Mr. President, let us look at the consequences of these errors. And the COVID slides paint a grim picture of the consequences. Now, what is interesting, Mr. President, if you can see that graph, the first few months, the line is almost flat. It's imperceptible at this stage that there were actually infections at that stage because there were so few. But yet,
Senator Bunting, you don't have a printed copy.
I will email you a copy. I'm saving the trees, Mr. President. But it's almost a complete flat line. And really, you remember, we were having weekly press briefings on Mondays, sometimes daily. And then we would have a press briefing on Monday and Tuesday. You'd come to Parliament and the Prime Minister would go on for another 2 hours. With his graphs. That's when we did with plenty graphs. That's when just in the little baby stage. As you go on, if you go on and you look at the last section of that graph, it is almost vertical, the line of confirming COVID-19 cases. It has gone almost vertical.
Inversely related with the press briefing?
No, the Prime Minister seems to have gone into hiding. He don't want to touch COVID at all. Does not want to touch COVID at all. Since the first case of COVID in Jamaica, we have had over 80,000 cases of the virus confirmed, infections confirmed. and over 1,800 deaths. Over 1,800 deaths, with hundreds more still under investigation by the Ministry of Health and Wellness. So, Senator Webby, just since you opened the debate on the 25th of June, cases, cumulative cases, have increased by 60% in those 3 months. And deaths have increased by 80 up to 100% when we resolve the deaths under investigation. We could have had in the last 3 months almost a doubling of the deaths from COVID. Wow. So if you just back up to the previous graph for me, you'll see that's the cumulative confirmed COVID-19 deaths. Again, you will see recently it is almost a vertical line. No more talk about flattening the curve because we have been doing so poorly in this third wave. If you move to the figure 3, and what that graph does is show the recent spike, our performance during the recent spike, daily new confirmed COVID-19 cases per million people, and comparing us with a selected group of countries. And if you even look at the line, and you may not be able to pick it up, but I'll tell you, there's a line in there for Trinidad and Tobago, which starts on the left side as the highest line. Because you remember Trinidad struggled at one point to contain their cases. But by early September, we had overtaken them, and they continue trending down. So we are still, even at this point, higher than Trinidad and Tobago, and certainly higher than Canada, Germany, etc. Now if you go to the next figure 4, the share of people vaccinated against COVID-19. You may not be able to read the names, but I can help you. The name at the very bottom of that chart is Jamaica. This is showing the share of people in the country vaccinated against COVID-19. Jamaica has 17%. Above us, St. Vincent, Bahamas, Grenada, Dominica, Trinidad and Tobago, population half our size, they have administered more vaccines, absolute numbers, than we have. They're at 40%, we're at 17. Barbados, 45, Antigua, 46, and so on. We're not even going to bother to include countries like the Cayman Islands, which are at 82. They're obviously very small and a special case, so I'm not going to compare there, but I think a Trinidad or a Barbados is certainly a fair comparator. In comparison to the other islands, we are at the bottom. The government must take some responsibility for the consequences of this, the significant loss of life. Jamaica was slow to act in purchasing vaccines, slow to implement a meaningful distribution plan, and slow to get vaccines into the arms of the most vulnerable in hard-to-reach areas. It's one thing to bring everybody and blitz at the National Stadium, but the persons up in Flamstead, the elderly in deep rural areas, persons with mental or physical disabilities, those persons have largely been forgotten in these first blitzes. We have been subjected to a stop-start opening and closing of our economy. Poorly planned restrictive curfew hours and even more restrictive no movement days have pummeled the incomes of the most marginal in the society. It has piled people on top of each other in public transportation, in supermarkets and in government offices in order to comply or attempt to comply with the limited operating hours. And that in itself has accelerated community spread. Monthly paid employees may have been saved the worst, but the daily paid employees, those in domestic service, in retail, in landscaping, have borne the brunt of the income loss. The pan chicken man, the community cook shop, the small restaurant operator, they've all been left to look on enviously as the international franchises are allowed to open and monopolize food sales on no movement days. While
on the corner shop.
to open and monopolize food sales on no movement days, while the New Kingston hotels serve pink champagne to the political elites.
What? Matthew wasn't there.
Mr. President,
What a champagne then,
He
wasn't there. He wasn't there. No. That's a question.
Mr. President, I want to turn to national security. When it comes to our safety and security, the state of the nation is dire. Jamaica's violent crime problem has been with us for decades. However, the escalation in murders over the recent years has been extremely disappointing, given the massive allocations in capital expenditure and budgets more generally, far exceeding the financial resources available to any other administration. And secondly, the years of the serial and routine use of states of emergency as a crime-fighting tool, which we were told would be the panacea, and which, despite warnings and subsequent court ruling as to its unconstitutionality, the statistics now reveal that all of that was for naught, as the number of murders each year continues to increase. The last published JCF crime statistics shows that for the period January 1st to September 18th, there were 1,019 murders, which represented an increase of 10%, or an additional 94 murders in the first 8+ months of this year relative to the same period for the previous year. At the present year-to-date rate, we can extrapolate a figure of 1,425 murders by the end of the year. 1,425 murders. That would place us 200+ murders higher than 2015, when then opposition leader Andrew Hounis was all over Jamaica promising that if only he were elected, Jamaicans would be able to sleep at night with their windows and doors open. So, President, I don't know if colleagues saw the recent Bite of the Week on television, but it featured a woman saying that no, she cannot even sleep with her keyhole open, much less the door, much less the windows.
What?
Not even the keyhole in the door, much less the door. The murders of women and children. Okay. I hope we can continue to the end.
Mr. President.
Senator Hill, you know that normally as the leader of opposition business in the Senate, he would be given an additional 15 minutes anyway. So I'm going to suggest that you ask the members to approve that he is given sufficient time to complete his presentation.
Mr. President, indeed, the Speaker's time is up, and I'm asking our colleagues that he be given sufficient time to finish his presentation.
Those in favor? Against?
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, colleagues. The murders of women and children, year to date, again I'm giving you the year to date figures, were up by an even greater percentage of 17%. Jamaica continues to have one of the highest rates of femicide in the world, a terrible indictment on our society. Mr. President, when you look at the bar chart on the slide that's showing on the screen, it shows a geographic distribution of murders. Each one of those bars represents a parish, with the exception of the one in the center, which represents a combined Kingston and St. Andrew. It shows how murders are distributed on a per 100,000 basis. The bar on the extreme right in green is the average murder rate for the entire country, and that is 53 per 100,000. I actually said in green, but on the screen it looks like yellow. I guess it's high visibility yellow. High visibility yellow. However, what we can see from the height of those bars, which correspond to the number of murders per 100,000, is that there is quite a dramatic variation across Jamaica. If you look at the extreme left, that low blue bar represents Manchester. It is only 14 per 100,000. And let me quickly say, not that 14 per 100,000 is acceptable, but relatively speaking to the average of 53, it is less than a quarter of the national average. When you go to the center bar, which represents Kingston and St. Andrew, that is at a high of 90 per 100,000, almost twice the rest of Jamaica, or twice the Jamaican average. But if we go down, if we drill down even further, because the truth of the matter is, Lower St. Andrew and Kingston are as different from Upper St. Andrew as it is from Manchester. So if we drill down into the 4 police divisions, Kingston West, Kingston Central, Kingston East, and St. Andrew South, year-to-date murders in those 4 of the 19 police divisions, in those 4, year-to-date murders have increased by 27% to 329, and year-to-date shootings increased by 28% to 326. Now, Mr. President, you know that these divisions occupy a relatively tiny geographic area. My guess is it's about 40 square miles, or about 1% of Jamaica's land area. Yet that small 1% area is producing a third of all our murders, 33% of our murders, and 36% of our shootings nationally. Last weekend, I accompanied the leader of the opposition on a tour of the Kingston West Police Division. I was struck by the fact that the Community Safety Unit used the divisional headquarters conference room as a safe space for children to come and do schoolwork. Those children have no other access to the internet, nor a space at home supportive of online learning. It was a commendable effort. The Denham Town Police Station, the divisional headquarters of Kingston West, upstairs, the conference room upstairs. And, you know, even while I was pleased to see the effort that the police were making, I recognized at the same time that it was really just a drop in the bucket compared with what is needed. But at least it told me that the police in the division recognize that for sustainable reduction in crime, social investment is what is needed in those disadvantaged communities. Good schools with nutrition programs, better public health infrastructure, better physical infrastructure, and measures to protect the children from crime and violence. This chart, Mr. President, shows the annual number of murders in Jamaica over the last 14 years. And I would just say, if we exclude 2017 as an outlier, which will, be to the benefit of the government, the best we can say is that this administration has flattened the curve at a higher murder rate than they inherited. The following chart really represents the same statistics, but put in 4-year buckets, showing the average annual number of murders for the successive periods. So from 2008 to 2011, in that 4-year period, the average annual number of murders was 1,471. For 2012 to 2015, that's the first grade. For 2012 to 2015, the one in red, although on the board it might look a little orange, the average annual number there was 1,129. So it had dropped by about 340 per year. So if you take the average the savings, the lives saved over those 4 years, it would be the equivalent of having an entire year without a single murder. But by the time we go to 26 to 2019, the annual average was back up at 1,407, not far from where it looks like we may end up this year. Mr. President, there must have been something that the PNP administration of 2012 to 2015 was doing right. To have produced the lowest numbers in the last 2 decades, even with much fewer financial resources.
And no states of emergency.
What was the difference? And no states of emergency. What was the difference? Let me remind you. Our administration took a holistic approach to crime management, which balanced crime control with crime prevention through social interventions and social investment. We emphasized community-based policing and de-emphasized paramilitary-style policing. We trained and deployed violence interrupters in partnership with the Peace Management Initiative. We decriminalized personal use of ganja. We decriminalized personal use of ganja to reduce friction between the police and the community. This was a massive success of then Minister of Justice and now Leader of the Opposition, Mark Golding. We merged the JCF and the ISCF for administrative efficiency and to release more personnel for underground policing. And we forged a broad-based partnership between various ministries of government, faith-based organizations, and civil society groups under the umbrella of the Unite for Change initiative. I've mentioned before, Mr. President, the resources that this government has had. And let me be the first to say, I wanted more resources for the ministry when I was minister. I would have been very happy if I'd got a 50% increase or a 100% increase. I would have been ecstatic. This minister, or I should say these ministers, have enjoyed up to 1,000% increase in their capital budget. Let's look at well, first of all, that first chart shows you the budget comparison of the Ministry of National Security versus the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health. And what it shows is that in comparative terms, the Ministry of National Security has grown much closer to what is traditionally a top ministry, the Ministry of Health. And I'm talking outside of the Ministry of Finance, which has the, debt financing and all that. But it is particularly dramatic when we look at the capital budget, which is the next slide. That red line at the top is the Ministry of National Security's budget from year to year, from the years 2014-15 to 2021-22. And the other two lines are the capital budget for the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health. What you'll see there is they all started between $1 billion and $2 billion, thereabout, while the Ministry of National Security went up to $19.5 billion. That's the peak there in 2019-2020. At all times for the last 4 years, the capital budget of national security has been between twice and 3 times the size of the combined capital budgets of the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education. Yet we have seen no improvement that is in any way commensurate with this massive increase. When we go further, delve further into the national security budget, we find that the recurrent budget has increased from 50 billion to just over 80 billion in 21-22. 50 billion in 2014-2015, climbing gradually to 80 billion in 2021-22. The JDF's recurrent budget has more than doubled from 12 to over 26 billion. The JCF's recurrent budget has increased by a more modest figure. On the capital expenditure side, The JDF has again enjoyed the lion's share of the ministry's budget, consistently receiving an allocation of twice the capital budget of the police. That's for the last 4 years. The JDF's capital budget peaked at over 12 billion in 1 year. The JDF, 12 billion in 1 year. And as you saw in the crime statistics, we have precious little to show for it in terms of results. Mr. President, as a result of this badly skewed expenditure, one of the areas that has suffered is the force strength of the GSCF. It has on average declined, and by force strength, you mean the actual number of regular officers who are in service. That number has on average declined over the last 5 years, despite the massive increase in budget allocations to the ministry. In fact, the number of police personnel remains, and I'm taking the figures from the Economic and Social Survey of Jamaica, so it's comparing year end to year end. The year end figure at 2020, which is the most recent Economics and Social Survey, shows that the number of police personnel at 11,800 is just about where it was in 2015, and well below its establishment of 14,000. In the comparable period, the JDF has enjoyed a large increase in both the approved establishment and in the strength. That is the actual number of soldiers. The excessive spending on the Jamaica Defense Force, while not correspondingly increasing the strength or the capacity of the constabulary force, treating the JSCF in many ways as a poor cousin of the ministry, has resulted in worsening crime statistics. Mr. President, I turn now to some of the other impacts of COVID on the economy and society. And COVID has, of course, been the dominant feature of the year. The last year, as Senator Webby said in his opening, was very challenging. Real GDP declined by 10% for the calendar year and 11% for the fiscal year. While there has been some recovery of last year's decline in GDP this year, the low vaccination rates and the erratic stops and starts of reopening make it clear that our economic recovery will require a multi-year effort to get us back to pre-COVID levels. In the meantime, the consequences of the fallout continue to be borne principally by the most disadvantaged. The graph of annual GDP per capita for the last half century is sobering. Shows that we have not had consistent high growth since the bauxite alumina investments of the 50s and 60s. If we look at the stock market, it's accurate to say, while it is accurate to say that larger companies in the Jamaican economy have fared better, the JSE main market index is still almost 20% below where it was just prior to COVID. This suggests that Jamaican investors are not expecting, Senator Webby, a rapid or V-shaped recovery. Happily, Grace Kennedy investors are, but this is not the general market sentiment, as our market index is still considerably below. By comparison, of course, if you look at the S&P 500, which fell sharply in March 2020, they had fully recovered by September, and they're now about 30% higher than the pre-COVID level. Of course, again, the comparison with the USA and other countries with high vaccination rates means that they're able to return to normal more quickly than countries with low vaccination rates like Jamaica. Unemployment, the unemployment rate has moved, but has deteriorated from 7.8 in 2019 to 9% in April this year. But it's youth employment that we should keep an eye on. Youth unemployment. That is now at 24.4% compared to 19% in 2019. Studies have shown that there's a correlation between crime and unemployment, and also that youth are both the principal victims and perpetrators of crime. So the sharp rise in youth unemployment may well be one of the contributors to the increased levels of violent crime we're experiencing. Mr. President, I won't touch on tourism since Senator Allen already dealt with that comprehensively. However, since the theme of my presentation is the double standards in society, I cannot but highlight the deeply unjust and heartbreaking treatment meted out to the ground transport operators and the craft vendors who were recently prevented from earning their traditional bread in the name of COVID restrictions, even while the larger hotels and attractions were able to conduct business as usual. Mr. President, for the 18 months of the pandemic, many Jamaicans have been without employment or reduced employment or compensation, struggling to access basic goods and food items. The cost of living is now so high that people are not only buying bread by the slice and toothpaste by the squeeze, but I saw recently that they have to be buying sugar by the spoon.
Teaspoon, not the spoon.
By the teaspoon. Gas prices are at their highest ever. Food, construction, hardware prices at their highest. If we look at the food, we see for basic food items, we've had increases from a low of 14% to a high of 50% when it comes to cooking oil. If we look at petroleum products, increases between 33 and 43%. If we looked at building materials, selected building materials, cement is at the low end, but when you look at something like farm ply, that has increased by 122% over the last year or so. So, Mr. President, I just want to close by looking at the way forward. If we continue on this path of rising crime, COVID, and cost of living, then the future state of our nation will be grim. Jamaica currently ranks 120 out of 158 in the Oxfam Commitment to Reducing Inequality Index, the CRI index. 120 out of 158, which means we're in the bottom quartile of the ranking. Yes, that's the CRI index measures government policies and actions in 3 areas that are proven to be directly related to reducing inequality. Public services such as health, education, and social protection, taxation, and workers' rights. Our regional rank is 21 out of 23, only scoring better than Haiti and Panama. This demonstrates almost no commitment to reducing inequality. We must do better. We must do better. One estimate is that the top 10% of income earners in Jamaica represent close to 50% of the national income, while the bottom 50% earn only about 10% of the national income. I don't know if I'm in the 1%, but I believe I'm in the top 10%. These inequalities will persist unless we fundamentally address some of the structural weaknesses in the economy. We have to build a more diverse economy that can withstand the effects of unforeseen disasters such as the COVID-19 pandemic. An economy that is not dependent on the success of any single sector. An economy which is digitally driven, human-centered, and highly efficient, and will provide greater employment opportunities for citizens and drive economic growth. A couple of the things that we can use to accelerate this, to turbocharge it. In the 70s, I believe it was, the rural electrification program was introduced. It was a recognition at that time that electricity had become essential to modern life. Today, we need a similar urgent national project to introduce broadband internet access to every household in Jamaica. Today, it is an essential tool of modern life. The project would include not just infrastructure, but also devices to access the infrastructure. Similar to the lifeline block concept in water utility tariff regimes, Senator Hill, the first, say, 25 megabits per second of bandwidth should be free or heavily subsidized. Premium speeds can then be charged at commercial rates. Private sector providers can compete for the contracts to service various areas depending on the technology that's appropriate for their specific population density and terrain. The important thing, Mr. President, is to not only relieve the challenges to remote learning, but longer term, it would facilitate a paradigm shift in access to quality education. Highly respected futurists, such as Professor Tony Clayton at UWI, with an international reputation for his work in this area, predict an imminent revolution in tertiary and even secondary education. And I quote from an unpublished article that will be coming out shortly. Many of the world's best degree programs are already completely free. And some of the interactive online packages are now so good that students are learning the material in half the time that they take in the classroom. There are also new entrants into the sector, private and non-profit education companies offering tailored educational and training products, free or at minimal cost. For the first time in history, cheap, efficient, and high-quality education is becoming universally available, end quote. Prof. Clayton is predicting that everyone will soon have access to affordable, high-quality education, provided that they have broadband internet. Prioritizing universal access will both mitigate the current disparities in online access, as well as facilitate cheap universal access to the best global resources longer term. It will also provide a critical infrastructure for e-commerce and improve the productivity of many small entrepreneurs, farmers, craftsmen, etc., particularly in the rural area. Mr. President, the string of civil unrest, social and political uprisings across the world since the onset of the pandemic should be an indication to governments that there are serious issues that need urgent attention. If we continue to ignore the underlying issues of inequality, of poor living conditions, of inadequate education and social services, then we will remain trapped in a cycle of low productivity, high crime, and poor living standards. Placing our people at the center of our development efforts require long-term investments to increase their quality of life and their employability, but also short-term shifts that cost little. Short-term shifts insisting, for example, that state agencies treat people with dignity and recognize their intrinsic value as human beings. So what would that look like? It would show a public-private partnership to administer vaccine in low-income and rural communities by healthcare providers known to community members. It would show a nation committed to protecting our citizens by requiring foreign travelers to be vaccinated when visiting our world-class tourist destinations, just as we will shortly be required to be vaccinated going to the US. It would look like a Ministry of Health with the foresight to diversify oxygen supplies and maintain oxygen generators to avoid any unnecessary deaths. It would look like a government more committed to the well-being of its people than partisan divisions, one which hosts regular DRMA council sessions and with the inclusion of all members. You would see a crime policy that balances crime control with crime prevention, one that reflects an understanding that successful policing must be based on mutual respect and trust between police and citizens. A policy that understands the complex root causes of crime and combats crime at the level of cause, not just at the symptoms, through social investment. And one that understands that you can be strong on crime while simultaneously being strong on upholding human and constitutional rights. People-centered development would ensure that long-term subsidies for poor populations were crippled by the skyrocketing cost of goods and services and combined with reduced incomes during the pandemic. Mr. President, the choice is ours. A more equitable Jamaica, free of double standards, or a Jamaica even more unequal than it was before the pandemic. It is time we make the right choices and place the Jamaican people at the center of our development. In that way, instead of having two Jamaicas, we can have one Jamaica, a country that treats everyone fairly and gives opportunity to all. Thank you.
Mr. President.
1 minute, Senator Samuda. I have to share this with Mr. Bunting. How can you have Senator Bunting talking about inequality and he's speaking longer than all the other members? Senator Minister, the Honorable Matthew Samuda. Thank you, Senator Bunting.
Mr. President, I suspect you have an opportunity to remove that inequality. And I remind my colleague, Senator Floyd Morris, that when he made his contribution and I was acting leader for the day, that I did ask for sufficient time for him to finish. So we have already sent a particular, we've already shown intention and set a particular precedent. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Mr. President, allow me to share with colleague senators, and indeed all who have joined the sitting through the PBCJ, a prayer that I came upon recently. I've been unsuccessful in identifying the author, but I still thought it useful to share. Heavenly Father, be merciful to our great land and to those who lead us in our communities, cities, and national government. Give to each a sense of calling. May each put a high value on justice, righteousness, honesty, and service. I thought this prayer a good reminder to myself and indeed my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Mr. President, I wish to place on record my thanks to the Prime Minister, the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, for the opportunity afforded me to serve in this capacity. Mr. President, I wish to also acknowledge you for your constant guidance in my political career thus far. It is well appreciated. So they know who to blame. To explain to this chamber, Mr. President, I have more people to thank than the sitting would allow, and to explain to this chamber how my family has supported and sacrificed for me would also take all day, but I have to acknowledge and thank them. Mr. President, I've highlighted many of those who have played critical roles in my personal development in the past, and they know who they are, but I again extend my gratitude. President, I wish to highlight those with whom we work. Firstly, the staff of this Parliament provides yeoman service, and on behalf of my colleagues, we thank you. Madam Clerk, I wish to acknowledge your ascension and extend my own congratulations and indeed my thanks for the support since joining this Parliament in 2016. Mr. President, I also must acknowledge those with whom I work at the Ministry of National Security, starting with DPM Dr. Horace Chang, and of course, led by the PS, Courtney Williams, and his chief technical directors. They are patriotic, professional, and deeply committed to making this nation safer. The men and women of the national security architecture are true heroes and give more than 100% and put themselves on the line despite the state not always being able to provide all they require. I salute them. I would also ask that you allow me to acknowledge Commodore Gorman, who we would have announced as the next Chief of Defense Staff, soon to be Rear Admiral Gorman. My colleagues in the government caucus have become an extended family. We've drawn closer over this last few months. We work daily to further the agenda of this administration, the agenda supported by hundreds of thousands of Jamaicans who gave the Jamaica Labour Party a renewed mandate in the most difficult of circumstances, facing the global challenge of a century. Quite frankly, the margins showed they trust this government, and we must build on that. Mr. President, despite our resounding victory, the challenges we face require a bipartisan effort. Project Jamaica the aspirations largely defined by the Vision 2030 needs all of us if it is to take the shape we desire. Mr. President, I've never once doubted the patriotism of my colleagues on either side of the divide. The commitment to national development is put on display weekly in this chamber. Our spirited debates, as we fulfill our mandate as the nation's legislative review chamber, can sometimes give rise to acrimonious relationships. Mr. President, we have had moments in recent times which have tested the ability of our ability to work across the aisle. It is understandable, I'm sure not even unusual in a parliamentary democracy. I, however, again extend the invitation to colleagues across the aisle to join us in breaking bread in the dining hall of the Parliament at the end of each week's sitting. I believe this can assist in bridging the divide. My presentations have followed a consistent format and approach in these State of the Nation debates, Mr. President. Previous to being sworn in the Cabinet, it was known that I focused on the economy, the environment, the general well-being of citizens, of course the issues of the day, and we had to throw in an occasional political jab or two. These are not the issues I can focus on this year, based on my ministerial assignment, but there are issues to which I hope to see colleagues pay keen attention as the State of the Nation debate progresses. Mr. President, my contribution to the State of the Nation debate is indeed my first as a member of the Cabinet. Mr. President, I've chosen to present under the theme, Securing Our Future. This against the quoted backdrop of Peter Drucker, who said, "The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it is to act with yesterday's logic." Allow me to first highlight the security situation as I see it. And before I dive into the substance, and it is precisely because I appreciate the nature of the State of the Nation debate and the importance of the platform that it gives to all senators to share how they see the State of the Nation and their recommendations, that I try to avoid taking points of order in the space, because I believe persons should be left largely uninterrupted. But just to respond to one point, Senator Bunting, there is no troll army employed by the government or the political party to which I'm a member. The people on social media just don't like you guys. And quite frankly, because you said we have employed a troll army, I think it should be retracted. It should be retracted at your next opportunity. So retracted. However, Mr. President, well, let me put it to you this way. There's much more to respond to, and it's early. And I will take the advice of my colleague.
You'll notice that Senator Bunting spoke without interruption, At the same time, all right, let me just leave it at that.
Mr. President, securing our future is consistent with the goals we all have as citizens. In fact, we have consensus on this goal. It is reflected in Jamaica's overall effort to realize Vision 2030 and to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Specifically, it is the role of our national security MDAs to pursue Goal 2 of Vision 2030, which is to make the Jamaican society secure, cohesive, and just, as well as to achieve UN SDG 16, which is to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. The national security ecosystem is not always understood by citizens, and I'd like to share a bit about it this morning. The ecosystem we have put in place as a country to achieve these goals is represented below, and colleagues will see it in the document that I've circulated. Important to note, outside of the infrastructure and the ecosystem within the ministry, there are other agencies that span across mainly four ministries. This is in no way, in mentioning these four ministries, intended to shirk responsibility rather to ensure colleagues and indeed those watching at home understand how we have approached security as a nation. So you have agencies like an FID and customs which fall under finance, for instance. So not all the security agencies fall at security. Port security is at transport. You have agencies like the municipal police that work with municipal corporations. So security is a national responsibility that spans the space. We all have a role to play in making Jamaica safer. However, we at the MNS accept our awesome leadership responsibility in achieving this with humility and cognizance of the implications of our work. You know, Senator Bunting spoke to the resource allocation to the ministry, and I would like to touch on this, having shown what the agency structure looks like. Our agency structure includes MOCA, Red Track, IFLSM, the JCF, DCS, PSRA, PICA, JDF, the FLA, the JCCF. So it's a wide, diverse ministry with several agencies that work daily to make us safer. Now that comes with particular needs, it comes with particular expenses. Mr. President, it is important also for colleagues to understand what we have spent to achieve the levels of security we have or don't have. The table below clearly shows that as a nation we have not sufficiently prioritized the need for security as a pillar for achieving our development goals. It should be noted that this government has prioritized the national security fight and continues to increase the rate of investment in this area. The evolving crime situation locally and regionally, quite frankly, will require the GOJ to invest at a higher rate if it is to ensure a robust architecture is in place. All of this is to ensure that colleagues appreciate that investment simply doesn't, the level of investment rather, simply doesn't provide the required levels of border security, policing, offender management, or data security. Mr. President, I noted the presentation of Senator Bunting, and he alluded to the capital expenditure of 19 billion in, I think it was 2019 rather. Now, the sorts of equipment, technologies, and skill sets that we require to guard our borders, to provide the sort of security that we need to curtail the importation of weapons, to disrupt drug trafficking, Mr. President, quite frankly, is not cheap. The sorts of technology and equipment that you require is not purchasable on a shelf. It is very expensive. Upon forming government in 2016, it was clear that what we require for our border security was simply not there. We have had to purchase planes, helicopters, other air technology, ships, and boats for our police. This has resulted, Mr. President, in record seizures of narcotics, Mr. President. Now, sometimes we don't quite understand the importance of our border security, but this government does. And the fact is you can't build the infrastructure required and go halfway. There is more to be invested to achieve this. We're not going to allow what we found to ever take place under this government. When we came in, if we had untied the two ships in Port Royal, one of them probably would have sunk. That is how degraded our border security infrastructure was. And we are making the investment to return it to to a standard fitting the threats that we face. And there's a lot more to do, colleagues, quite frankly. So there's more to be spent, if we're to be honest. The other issue that I think colleagues should be aware of, because Jamaica is a small country, right? All of us would know policemen and women who work across the varying parishes in police stations everywhere. We'd have gone to school with some. We know many police officers. When you see the conditions that we had our officers working in 2016, it was truly deplorable. We went about a project that we dubbed Project Rock. We did a full engineering assessment of all of our police stations, and we prioritized what needed to be done, and we went about the process of rebuilding and renovating these stations. Mr. President, over 100 police stations have benefited. We have provided greater mobility for the force so that they're able to do their job. So I will not stand here, Mr. President, and say to the policemen and women that we will not continue to prioritize the investment that makes them A, able to do their job, and B, provides a sort of environment that is fitting for their work as well as fitting to the communities they serve. So we stand by that investment, and as soon as the robustness and buoyancy returns to the economy, we will continue along the program that deals with these issues, Mr. President. Mr. President, when you look at the table, I agree with Senator Bunting. He needed more money. I can't say what the cabinet discussions would have been like while you would have debated budgets between 2012 and 2015. There was no doubt a difficult period by way of the IMF restrictions that we would have had. But as a percentage of your total allocation, you had percentages of 2.5 in the lowest year and 2.17 in your last year, Mr. President. Now, in that last year of the PNP being in power, we saw significant increases in the rate of murder. 2014, you had decreases. In 2015, they started to go back up. And the trend was like that. The trend, I come into your numbers. But you inherited a decline and you passed on an incline. That is impatient of debate. Now, statistics and how you will not disturb the Senate. You know, I get along well with Senator Bunting. And I never disturb his presentations, President. I am sure ready strong. But I expect the extended courtesy that I would have extended. Well, we won't get into that. But Mr. President, if you look at the Category 1 crimes, and you look at the table, you will see that generally the trajectory is like that. It's facing downward, right? Your acquisitory crimes from 2010 to 2020 have declined significantly. That is your robbery, your break-ins, your larceny. That trend is clear, right? There is no arguing of that point, Mr. President. It is your murder and shooting crimes that have largely stayed within a band for the last 22 years of between 1,000 and 1,600 murders. You've had 3 outlier years that would have breached the 1,600 mark, and I think 1 year that we went marginally below 1,000. So, Mr. President, we have not broken the back of the gang crime that is conducted with guns that ends in shooting and murder. We have not broken the back in that space. However, when you look at crimes like rape, I believe it shows a particular route to dealing with some of these issues. And I've never spoken about the declines in rape and the increases in clear-up rates in that area without giving initial credit. The credit for passing the DNA legislation while Senator Bunting was minister should not be taken away, and he should be acknowledged for his work in that space. It has played a critical role in that decline. This government would have operationalized that legislation and invested over 1.2 billion in the IFLSM. So your DNA lab, your ballistics lab, your fingerprint capacities, all of the things that strengthen the investigative capacity of the force form a part of that investment. So yes, Mr. President, we are proud of that investment, because an investment and an operationalizing of a good piece of legislation has led to the decline in rapes, Mr. President. So we are proud of that investment. Mr. President, as I've mentioned, and we can't step away from this point, despite the fact that the overall crime rate continues to decline, despite the fact that in 5.5 years of the Jamaica Labour Party being at the helm of the government, despite the fact that there have been less total crimes in the 5.5 years that we have been here than the 4 years that my colleague was Minister of National Security, the murder numbers and shooting numbers have not come down. And I don't want to discuss statistics for these lightly, because each statistic represents a Jamaican who has been a victim. It represents a family that has had to deal with the impact of that. So the statistics I know hurt all of us who work in the national security space. I know it affects deeply all of us who work in government, because each statistic is a Jamaican who has suffered and in some cases lost their life, and it is a family that is hurting. So I don't discuss these statistics lightly. But the simple fact, Mr. President, is that between 1999 and 2021, we've stayed in a band between 1,000 and 1,600 murders as a country. Now, Mr. President, 1,000 is nothing. Well, you've averaged generally approximately 1,300, right? You have outlier years, and there's a particular pattern which is emerging if you look at the 22-year period. But generally, the average, the lowest level of that band, Mr. President, is unacceptable and should be seen as such by all members of society. But what's important to note, and I'm glad he showed it, was the rate, the total rate per 100,000. When you compare that to the global average of 6, the only one word that comes to mind is that it is an emergency. But we'll get to that in a few. The police divisions, as he mentioned, as Senator Bunting would have mentioned, which have accounted for the increase in murders this year in shootings, are largely the 3 Kingston divisions, which is Kingston Eastern, Kingston Central, Kingston Western, Southern St. Andrew, the police division, not the political space, because Kingston Western Police Division crosses over into the Southern St. Andrew political space, so it's not absolute in terms of how many members would think of it. St. James and Westmoreland. There's a common thread, Mr. President. These police divisions have a particular type of gang activity. That is the situation on the ground. Up to last year, August, they were under states of emergency. And quite frankly, Mr. President, the work that is required and that was being done under the state of emergency was not yet complete. We have said to the country that these areas require extraordinary security measures. Now, despite Senator Bunting's presentation, you may think he doesn't believe that because of how he framed his arguments. But the People's National Party last year would have signed on to the crime consensus with the Jamaica Labour Party, where we were trying to set parameters that we would agree on as a country. One of those parameters is that murder rates above 30 per 100,000 require extra security measures. Now, all of the police divisions, you will note, coming from Senator Bunting's presentation, that account for the increase in murders are above 30. I think one was at 90, which is the Kingston, so you amalgamated the Kingston space. So I know there is agreement that extra security measures are required for these areas, despite how Senator Bunting framed his arguments, because there has been no withdrawal from the consensus document signed by the opposition. In fact, I often attend the meetings on behalf of DPM Dr. Horace Chang, and so every once in a while, myself and Senator Bunting agree, and every once in a while we don't. But he attends the meeting, so I know they haven't withdrawn. So I know there's agreement across the aisle that extra security measures, or extraordinary rather, security measures are required because above 30 it's an emergency. The opposition agrees, Mr. President. They're just contorting themselves and the argument and giving the public the wrong impression, but they agree. Because, you know, we come to that. We come to that. I'm, however, Mr. President, this, I will say afternoon now, rolling the wicket so that there is greater understanding, not just in this chamber, but in the public, for the policy and operational choices which are to be made. There are legislative hurdles, there are operational hurdles, but we will overcome those and we will provide the additional support that comes from extraordinary security measures to bring about safety and peace in these communities. Mr. President, earlier this year, DPM Dr. Horace Chang gave a full overview of the plans of the national security architecture when he made his contribution to the sectoral debate. As he mentioned, however, it is often the JCF which is seen as a face of security for obvious reasons. It's the primary point of interaction for citizens with the national security architecture. I believe also in his presentation he outlined comprehensively the route of modernization and reform, so no one can see the Jamaica Constabulary Force as poor cousins. We've also, and a point made, and just to respond briefly, the issues why the force has not increased in size, certainly over the last year, are unfortunately COVID-related. It has affected our rate of training and recruitment because of the DRMA and how many people you put in classrooms, etc. That has slowed the increases in the size of the force. There's no two ways about that. I would have loved the force to be at the targets that we've set. COVID intervened. The legislative focus was also clearly explained. 3 critical pieces of legislation will come to this Parliament for consideration before the end of the calendar year. They include the Firearms Act, they include the Corrections Act, and they include the final MOCA regulations. We would have already gone through, I think, 2 pieces of legislation in this chamber to give MOCA its independence. Mr. President, the suite of legislation, the investments made, the strategies put in place will secure Jamaica's future. We have not, over the last 2 or 3 decades, invested not just the money, but in the legislation, in the training, in the people that we require to provide the security for an evolving security threat. This government is breaking that trend. We're not doing knee-jerk things, we're not doing short-term measures. We're breaking the trend. You're seeing some of the early signs of those benefits. We're aware of a particular court case, which I won't speak too much, Mr. President, but it has gotten significant national attention. We're aware of a conviction of a multi-murderer from Clarendon, Mr. President. You're seeing the benefits of the investment in the technology. You're seeing the benefits of the leadership of the force. You're seeing the benefits of the infrastructure. You're seeing the benefits of the science by way of the DNA lab and the ballistics lab, etc. We will get through this. Now, that doesn't absolve any increase in murders, Mr. President. We will do what we have to do to curtail the current increases and to bring it back down, because it is our intention to ensure that that is done. But I'm making it clear, the sorts of infrastructure, technology, and scientific investments required don't come overnight. And just like legislation, Senator Bunting would know when he passed the anti-gang legislation, legislative changes take a certain period to see the impact of it unless it's a financial bill. We're now seeing the impact of the anti-gang bill after revision, because it was tested and gaps were seen, and the security forces themselves had to learn how to use it in a particular way. So the legislative measures that we have been putting in place, like MOCA's full strength will be seen very soon, I have no doubt. The strength and the benefits from the measures and the laws that we will change, you will see in time. So it is not a short-term fight, Mr. President, because the matter was allowed to get out of hand from 1989 all the way to 2005 when it peaked. That's just a fact. And we took too long to put in the investment and the legal changes that we require. And it does take time for them to kick into effect. That doesn't, as I said, absolve us, but we will do what we have to do operationally to bring things back in line. Today, Mr. President, beyond the overview provided, I would like to focus on the agencies and programs under my stewardship. They include offender management, which most of us would consider the Department of Correctional Services, the Private Security Regulatory Authority, the Jamaica Combined Cadet Force, and the role of national security MDAs in the COVID fight, the DRMA enforcement, the Controlled Reentry Program, and the ENDS program. And no, Mr. President, it's not as long as it sounds. So now I start. No, man, that was the intro. Now we start. Mr. President, the DCS is what I would actually like a glass of water if you could assist me. The DCS is comprised of 16 probation offices, 7 adult correctional facilities, 4 juvenile facilities, but indeed has one mission. It says we contribute to national security by securing, supervising, rehabilitating, and reintegrating offenders as productive, law-abiding citizens. Now, DCS, Senator Bunting, and you would notice sometimes in the ministry feel like the poor cousins, but I can tell you, you have some of the most committed men and women in the, I come into what we're doing for them, have some of the most committed men and women in law enforcement working within DCS, and I just pause to acknowledge them, Mr. President, and thank them for their service. No problem. I don't have any negotiations with Lame because I support what he's requesting. I just don't have the checkbook. So, me and Lame don't have any negotiations to have. I know that my correctional officers and my non-uniform staff deserve much more, and if I could give more, I would give it. I do what I can. Absolutely. If we are to secure our future, Mr. President, rehabilitation for successful reintegration is critical if we are to realize the security outcomes. The Offender Management, Rehabilitation Policy and Parole Board Administration Branch is the unit within the MNS which contributes to crime prevention by facilitating successful management, rehabilitation and reintegration of offenders. As of last year, this branch has been charged by Cabinet with developing an offender management policy. This document will establish a blueprint for increasing the support received by all offenders from entry into a correctional facility throughout the rehabilitation process and during reintegration. The policy will focus less on punitive measures and instead support successful offender outcomes. This support is expected to result in a lower risk of reoffending and hence a lower level of crime. A second draft of the policy is under review and finalization is projected before December 31st, 2021. Colleagues, important to note, and as strange as this may sound, such a policy is the first of its kind for Jamaica. We never had one. And if you don't know, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So the truth is we are setting the map and the route in terms of fixing our reoffending and chronic issues of recidivism. Mr. President, the branch is also leading the effort to revamp. Mr. President, the branch is also leading the effort to revamp the legislative framework that governs the administration of corrections in Jamaica, specifically the amendments to the Corrections Act 1985 and Correctional Institutional Adult Correctional Center Rules 1991. The new legislation will provide significant support for the changes which are being proposed by the offender management policy. To note, we have decided to approach the legislative overhaul in two phases. One of the things that I've learned and come to understand firsthand is the process of developing legislation and just how long it is. So to ensure that we were able to solve some problems, we've broken the overhaul of the Act into two pieces. I mentioned that the first amendment will come before December 31st, actually in weeks, not months. This amendment, rather, will deal with the issue of contraband, but I'll continue. Mr. President, on June 7th, 2021, the Cabinet approved the drafting instructions for the legislative amendments to the various sections of the Corrections Act and Adult Institution Rules to address the specific issues of prohibited items in Jamaica's correctional institutions, which allow for unauthorized communication outside the facility. This isn't because of songs being made. This is directly because it is a matter of life and death. If we do not get the phones out, we cannot curtail and stop the running of gangs behind our facilities. The first phase of the amendment is intended to provide stronger legislative support to the security arrangements and controls within correctional centers, while facilitating tighter control of prohibited articles being transported in and out of our centers. Mr. President, this is nothing to scoff at. It is a chronic issue. It has been allowed to stay for far too long, and we have reaped the benefits. I will get into the other measures that we will take in terms of operationalizing the legislation that will come.
Mr. President, the Minister's time for speaking having expired, I would like to give him at least 3 more hours to complete. Give him time necessary to complete his presentation.
Members would have heard the question. Those in favor? Against?
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, colleagues. To achieve this vision, the Department of Correctional Services will treat our inmates and wards as clients. This is a major cultural shift. Provide support for each client from entry until they are reintegrated. Rely heavily on scientific evidence in assessing the needs of each client, and be more proactive in making necessary interventions. Develop new and greater partnerships, particularly for rehabilitation and reintegration, as we seek successful offender outcomes. In tandem with the offender management strategy, the youth offending strategy, which is geared towards reducing reoffending and offending amongst youths who have run afoul of the law, will continue to evolve within the current financial year. Additionally, the implementation of the Correctional Services Technical Working Group to address issues with a focus on the duty of care to the juvenile wards, especially in respect to appropriate measures of discipline and timely access to education and psychological interventions, will provide meaningful resources to guide the government in its effort to improve youth policy, as well as assist in the coordination of the delivery of services to our youth. The youth offending strategy will also focus heavily on diverting children from the criminal justice system toward more therapeutic interventions which will enhance their social adjustment. I'll make a quick point, Mr. President. I spoke with Minister Favour Williams this morning, and we've given the commitment previously, and we're nearing actualization of that commitment, that this government will amend the Child Care and Protection Act to cease the practice of uncontrollable children being sent to our prisons. That will happen this calendar year. No, third, but it is almost upon us.
Senator Samuda, stick to your presentation and don't not be disrupted.
Thank you, President. Agenda-based violence intervention is being coordinated within the juvenile centres, commencing with the South Camp Juvenile Correctional and Remand Centre. This comes amidst the continued acts of violence perpetrated against our women and girls, as well as the observed lack of empowerment among girls within the centre surrounding issues of gender roles and relationships. Once introduced in our male juvenile facilities, the intervention will educate our boys who hold many misconceptions towards their roles, including how women should be treated. Mr. President, now the elephant in the room, the physical infrastructure. The total population within the custody of DCS hovers up around 3,700 people, approximately 300 of which are juveniles. Unfortunately, the great majority of our adult population, approximately 2,500 inmates depending on the daily muster, are housed in two institutions, both of which were constructed in the 19th century. Moreover, one of those institutions is more than 100% overpopulated, while the other normally operates at full capacity. To note, this is the only facility of the 11 which is overpopulated, but there are particular nuances with how you distribute your prison population that causes particular challenges with how you separate and assign persons. Mr. President, this situation is incongruous with the direction we envision for Jamaica's correctional system. Our facilities ought to serve both a rehabilitative and a custodial function, but they were mainly constructed with the latter in mind. But their deteriorating state even undermines that function. The existing infrastructure at that facility and others in need of upgrading will shore up their respective capacities. The government will, in short order, commence investing in augmenting the current infrastructure of our correctional centres at a rate that we have not seen previously. That is why, Mr. President, during my tenure at the ministry, I have made it my priority to ensure that all proposed DCS infrastructure projects are properly and fully scoped. This way, when scarce funds do become available, these infrastructure projects will be shovel-ready. Infrastructure assessments by engineers are now underway to properly assess the sustainability and state of all DCS infrastructure, which will allow us to properly program public expenditure. Of course, Most such projects would merely amount to a facelift of current facilities, which would only address DCS's short-term needs. In the mid to long term, Mr. President, the government will need to construct a state-of-the-art Supermax facility. The discussions related to such a facility have been taking place over a number of years across successive administrations. Number of decades. I'll stick with that. That's fine. During my tenure here, we have convened a working group comprising DBJ officials and MNS and DCS staff to complete the planning and scope of the Supermax facility, so that when the funding does become available and we sign off on the financing modality, construction will be able to start. We are also paying keen attention to our particularly vulnerable population within our facilities, such as the juvenile wards and the infirmed inmates. At the Rio Cobra Juvenile Facility, we are in the progress of completing the renovation of a housing block that will give the institution enough space to house all boys within the custody of DCS who have received convictions. Now, this renovation is a significant change for how these juveniles are held. The issue would have been brought to the fore in the INDICOM report. I'm proud of the progress. We're not there yet, but it is a significant improvement already. And I look forward to opening of the new sections of the facility, including new classrooms, etc. Mr. President, at the Tamarind Farm Adult Correctional Center, we have recently repurposed a space specifically for the infirmed inmates who cannot be housed with the general population, especially as COVID still lurks. This facility is one of the changes that have been made to help DCS avoid the issues and mistakes that led to the state of Noel Chambers at the time of his death. This facility is being designed properly with the sorts of sidebars, the sort of ramps, the sort of infrastructure that at least creates a space for the care. We are also investing in the staffing that will be required to ensure that that issue never reoccurs. Mr. President, while we are scoping major physical infrastructure projects, we are focused on implementing the technological projects in the DCS. The DCS IT plan rests on 4 pillars: computer networking, communications, surveillance, and connectivity. The first priority of the plan is to push forward the rollout of the network infrastructure at all DCS facilities and offices. Currently, just about half these locations have adequate computer networks installed. As a result, vital information and data must still be recorded and stored in hard copy. The inefficiency in terms of physical space and time spent searching through files for information cannot be overemphasized. Thus, the focus placed by the government on adequately equipping DCS to record and access this information digitally. Given that security is core to the correctional services function, installing surveillance systems in all facilities is necessary. Electronic surveillance protects both correctional officers and inmates by improving surveillance and recording incidents for independent verification. To this end, the IDB-funded Security Strengthening Project is helping the DCS to procure and install surveillance systems. This is an ongoing initiative, and it includes installation of CCTV systems, and internal networking, and monitoring room for the Horizon Adult Correctional Center, as well as the monitoring center at DCS headquarters itself. This project will be executed at a cost of approximately $30 million per institution, Mr. President. Currently, none of the DCS facilities are networked with the fiber optic cables required for the modern management of the organization. This is why the SSP has also embarked on a mission to connect 6 DCS locations, including the headquarters and our maximum security correctional centers, to GovNet fiber. From there, DCS will be responsible for connecting its remaining locations and offices. The connectivity component is critical to the most transformative management and IT initiative DCS has ever undertaken: an institutional-wide electronic correctional management system. The procurement process is almost complete, Mr. President. The system will facilitate the digital collection of data, will make the tracking and monitoring of an inmate's well-being, rehabilitation, and court appearances much more efficient. It will also provide other vital management tools. This software is the first step to true modernization of the correctional services. The DCS is not just to hold individuals within its walls, Mr. President, but also to maintain and administer treatment in line with internationally recognized human rights standards. The duty of care extends beyond fulfilling the basic human needs of nutrition, shelter, and medical attention. The DCS is expected to engage in the rehabilitation of our clients who will one day rejoin society. Mr. President, our wards and inmates participate annually in external examinations, such as CSEC, CAPE, and the courses for their Jamaica school leaving certificate. Of the DCS's 11 correctional and remand facilities, 9 have active educational programs that currently employ 25 civilian teachers. Though the pandemic has affected 2020 and 21 enrollment numbers, 123 inmates and wards are registered to participate in the 2021 CSEC examinations. 2022 rather, sorry. A total of 601 inmates and wards are enrolled in the academic program, 385 inmates and 216 wards. The academic programs within the juvenile facilities are guided by the National Standard Curriculum and the Caribbean Secondary Education Certificate syllabus, while the adults are guided by the High School Diploma Equivalency Curriculum as well as the CSEC syllabus. 470 inmates and wards are enrolled in vocational programs, which are guided by the Heart Trust NSTA. Providing inmates and wards with practical vocational skills is both important for their rehabilitation and reintegration. Re-entering society with a skill makes them much more attractive for potential employers and better able to provide productive means of sustaining a living for themselves and their families. One of our vocational programs that has certainly produced positive effects is agriculture, Mr. President. We have revamped the DCS's farm program. The inmates involved in this program have become so proficient that we are now producing 100% of the poultry consumed in DCS facilities and produce enough eggs to feed all inmates twice weekly. Mr. President, I wish to also pause and acknowledge the support of Nutramix in our farming initiatives. They have given us significant support. The neighboring environment isn't so conducive for goats. Over the FY22 period, 30 more inmates are to be trained and certified under this initiative. And on the 15 acres of land DCS has under production now, we expect to double our output of vegetables. Mr. President, soon get there. Mr. President, youth offenders require special attention if we are to divert them from a life of crime. This is why the ministry has established the We Transform Youth Empowerment Program, and I acknowledge former colleague Senator Pernell Charles Jr., this was his brainchild. This program targets the reduction of readmission to the juvenile centers and by extension, crime and violence reduction. During the FY21 year, the We Transform program successfully developed various partnerships. Through these partnerships, the wards benefited from over 1.9 million worth of computer equipment and educational scholarships, and the training of mentors, vocational skills training to include a software coding program and internship placement, and the provision of entrepreneurial opportunities. Mr. President, additionally, we have added a woodwork shop and constructed a music studio, upgraded at our Metcalfe Street Remand Center. And I also pause to acknowledge Agent Sasko, who has been an integral mentor to many of our young boys at the Metcalfe facility and is teaching them music skills generally. The topic of mental health, Mr. President, and though I don't have eyes in the back of my head, I can imagine Senator Longmore paying keen attention to this particular section. Mr. President, there are also those in custody who need a deeper, more attentive level of care. Approximately 262 inmates have been diagnosed with mental disorders, 138 of which are unfit to plea, accounting for approximately 7% of our incarcerated population. However, this figure mostly represents those with psychotic disorders. We know that a greater proportion suffer from less apparent psychiatric conditions that go undiagnosed. Global studies suggest that incarcerated people are 2 to 3 times more likely to have a mental disorder and 15 times more likely to have a psychotic disorder than the general public. Mr. President, there remains major obstacles to delivering adequate care to these inmates. Those deemed unfit to plea have been essentially held in custody indefinitely, as they are unable to undergo trial and complete the judicial process. The correctional system in Jamaica, however, is not presently suited to the proper care of mentally ill, as it has inadequacies in personnel, programs, and physical infrastructure to ensure adequate treatment of the medical conditions and the eventual assessment and reintegration of unfit to plea inmates and convicts into the society. Mr. President, the DCS is a creature of instruction. It must provide adequate care to those individuals who are convicted or remanded by the courts, but it has no determination of what the correctional order is or isn't in terms of them being held in custody. I can assure members of the Senate and indeed the public that DCS is following its legal and moral obligations to provide reports to the courts while taking steps to seek the release of mentally ill where deemed appropriate. However, Mr. President, we continue to work to improve the care within the system with the resources we have. DCS has been authorized to hire an additional consultant forensic psychiatrist who will design and oversee a forensic mental health care program, Mr. President. But beyond that, we have started the process of reversing a tragic mistake made in the 1970s when the then government closed a forensic ward that housed inmates in need of psychiatric care. And the truth is, both sides kicked the can down the road. Our ministry has initiated the planning process with the Ministry of Health and Wellness and the Ministry of Local Government, it should read rather, to reopen a proper forensic ward to be completed within this term of government. To rebuild rather, it should have to rebuild and open a forensic ward. Our prison population is estimated to be around 137 inmates per 100,000. Consequently, Jamaica has the third lowest prison population in the entirety of the Caribbean and Latin America per capita. Now, that doesn't necessarily square with the other crime rates that you have, but it's a point that I think we should understand as we understand the next steps that are to be taken. The only countries in these regions with lower incarceration rates are, again, Venezuela and Haiti, whose chronic instability has undoubtedly hindered the reach of their criminal justice system. Jamaica's low incarceration rate is even more striking, as we know, when you consider the crime rates. Mr. President, as one considers the security contribution of the DCS, there are two factors which I believe are worthy of consideration. First, under the security heading, DCS has had one escapee in 3 years. One too many, however, an admirable rate of detention. Secondly, a more challenging issue, the issue of contraband. More specifically, the use of cellular phones in the commissioning of crimes and operation of criminal gangs from behind bars. Mr. President, though not new, this represents a continued threat to national security. Over the last 12 months, through renewed focus, we have removed some 2,300 phones from our facilities. The previous record was in the range of 1,100. We've changed systems, we've changed people, we've done a lot to deal with. In the rolling 12-month numbers, it's 2,300 phones. The following steps are being taken to create the environment to address this chronic issue. Amendment of our legislative framework to criminalize possession, use, and smuggling of electronic devices. It will come with custodial sentences. Procurement of appropriate technology to monitor entranceways, search and scan for devices, and disrupt electronic communique. That also comes under the SSP program that I mentioned earlier. Adjustment of training manuals and retraining of correctional officers, especially at your entry points. Infrastructural changes at points of entry. When you have facilities designed before a phone could have even been conceptualized, they're not necessarily built fit for purpose for the modern security threats that we face. DCS strives to play its part in protecting the public from dangerous actors, deterring crime, and administering justice for those who have been wronged by criminal elements, thereby helping Jamaica grow more secure, peaceful, and just. But these are the steps we will have to put in place if we are to make this a reality. Mr. President, the Big C has affected DCS as well. Maybe the most significant and problematic development to affect the correctional services worldwide has been the emergence of COVID-19. Despite the challenges posed by COVID-19, DCS has done well to mitigate the effects admirably. The institution's relative success is partly due to foresight. Sensitization to the potential threat began in late January 2020 through the sharing of basic facts that were known then about the virus with key members of DCS medical team and representatives of the correctional centers. Subsequently, a comprehensive contingency plan was prepared with the MOH, CDC, PAHO, and WH guidelines forming the foundation, while adding our national sensitivities. The DCS HQ then carried out an education effort targeting staff and inmates through the organization. Pamphlets were handed out, posters erected, radio stations in the facilities were used to share information. The parades were used as a platform to educate staff, small face-to-face sessions, all that you can imagine, and that would form the regular part of public education. Mr. President, once Jamaica recorded its first case of COVID-19, DCS implemented the measures in an attempt to prevent or delay the virus entering our correctional centers and to ensure that we had adequate systems in place for containment when inevitably it would. Mr. President, some measures that you can think of, which we all know are commonplace in all spaces: increased use of sanitizers, distribution of masks, quarantining those who leave facilities before re-entering the population. We even put in place, Mr. President, a digital courtroom at the Horizon space for mention dates so that inmates would not have to interact with the court system physically to reduce spread. Generally, Mr. President, we have had a lower infection rate up to this point than our neighbors, and we're proud of the team who has managed this implementation. A COVID task force was set up. Sorry? No, the neighbors in the region, sorry, the other prison systems in the region. I'll move through a little faster now. The procurement unit also had to readjust the way it did things. Some of the recurrent expenditure, so the savings, for instance, from your reduced need to purchase chicken has helped you in buying more sanitizers and masks. So the truth is the procurement team has had to be pretty nimble in how they manage a space, especially in the early stages where you had many shortages of many of the items that you'd have required. Mr. President, the current situation is that we have 58 inmates and wards who have tested positive for the virus, while active cases rather, and 7 who have been hospitalized. Additionally, 38 members of staff have tested positive and are in isolation. This shouldn't be surprising. We're dealing with community spread, but it's still important for colleagues to understand. The Medical Services Unit continues to work assiduously and has been unrelenting in the fight against the pandemic. And I have to acknowledge Dr. Poe, who is the SMO within our facilities and works tirelessly in this space. Mr. President, DCS has done well with the virus, but it has shown up the holes that we have in our infrastructure and the designs of our facilities as it relates to ventilation, as it relates to spacing, and these are some of the issues that we will have to adjust. We continue to focus on it, and we continue to do our best to mitigate entry of the virus into the facilities and containment when it comes. Mr. President, parole is a form of conditional release whereby
Senator Samuda, I'm following your presentation here. You are going to parole, but I would like you to address the question of the inoculation of the staff. You haven't did. I think you skipped that.
So, no, and I associate myself with the comments of Senator Campbell Rodriguez earlier. A person should take the vaccine as soon as it is available to them.
The numbers.
In our staff complement, we estimate that we have approximately 40% who have taken the vaccine at this stage, and several more who have indicated willingness and we're facilitating their mobilization, either to centers near to smaller facilities or actually doing exercises in the facilities. We have had a challenge in motivating the inmates to take this space, but I will say publicly the only way to resume visitation is through vaccination of our population. So we will continue to educate and motivate our inmates to take the vaccine. Motivate. So within the inmate population, it's a little over 10%. Within the staff population, it's over 40%. Well, it reflects some of the issues we have as a society. But on to parole, Mr. President. Parole is a form of conditional release whereby authority is granted to an inmate to live outside the penal institution under supervision rather than serve the entire sentence in the correctional facility. This conditional release is governed by the Parole Act of 1978. Overseeing the offender reintegration process is the parole board, which deliberates on applications and approves parole for those inmates who have demonstrated that they have been satisfactorily rehabilitated and are ready for reintegration. During the 2020-21 financial year, 67 cases were submitted to the parole board for consideration, of which 38 were granted parole, 21 refused, and 8 applications deferred for additional information. Mr. President, this was short of our target of 180, and it is, again, because of the big C. The field work that is required to create the files that allow for probation caused particular difficulty with workers, many of whom ended up catching COVID as they worked through communities, and that did have an effect and continues to have an effect. We are, however, working with communities to ensure that we catch up to the pace in the shortest possible time. Mr. President, that has brought me to the end of the corrections section of my presentation, and I will try to be brief with the other sections. Mr. President, the private security industry is a subject area to which I have been assigned. Jamaica has approximately 750 registered private security guards for every 100,000 people, representing a relatively high concentration of private security personnel per capita when compared globally. The industry has grown from 12,400 private security guards registered in 1995 to 22,600 registered in 2020. By contrast, the JCF is currently comprised of approximately 11,000 members, which sees the ratio of registered private security guards to JCF officers hovering around 2 to 1. The growth of the private security industry in Jamaica highlights the increasing importance of private security to the overall security and economic well-being of the nation. The Private Security Regulatory Authority is a statutory body under the MNS charged with monitoring and regulating the operations of private security firms, private security guards, private investigators, and security trainers. Its stated mission is to monitor and regulate organizations and individuals operating in the private security industry and to facilitate a close link between private security and state security in the interest of national well-being. Its vision is to promote international and professional standards and practices in the private security industry. It has the authority to grant, refuse, suspend, or cancel licenses as it may deem necessary for the purpose of executing its mandate under the PSRA Act. Mr. President, the PSRA has also had to expand and respond to the industry's growth. In the last financial year, we opened our office in Montego Bay, St. James, and we have started the initiatives to achieve ISO 9001 certification to increase PSRA's efficiency and management processes while we increase the footprint. Mr. President, this is a strategic industry. Proper regulation of the industry is important because private security firms contribute significantly to Jamaica's development by providing a range of services that enhance the security of public places residential areas, and workplaces, government offices, and critical national infrastructure, maintaining an environment conducive for business across all sectors. The private security industry is not only a facilitator of economic growth, but itself a strategic industry, crucial to advancing national security interests. Mr. President, the government of Jamaica's medium-term socio-economic policy framework 2018 to 2021 identifies governance of the private security industry within the strategy of strengthening the anti-crime capability of law enforcement agencies. The sector's strategy of strengthening governance and regulation of the private sector for a coherent public-private approach to promoting increased safety further speaks to the increased regulatory framework of the private security industry and ensuring the implementation systems of accountability. Mr. President, in short, the government cannot afford instability in the security industry. The government can also not afford security guards to not feel that they are appropriate and well-measured, well-appreciated stakeholders within that industry. A balance will have to be found while ensuring that we continue to facilitate economic growth through the provision of security and ensuring that we stick to the national security goals. Mr. President, the cadet force, which is not usually discussed in Parliament, I'll just briefly mention, because I know I've probably not probably, I've well overshot my time allotted to me.
I was looking forward to the cadet corps part of it because Lambert Brown and I were both in the GLP, Jamaica College Cadet Corps, you know.
Well,
Senator Brown and I.
I suspect one statement was true and one was nearly true. No. Mr. President, I now turn to the Jamaica Combined Cadet Force, a program that I believe holds great promise, not only for diverting at-risk youth, but also attracting some of our best and brightest into security service, specifically the JDF. It promotes discipline and patriotic service. It's at the core of the JCCF's mission. One of the 5 objectives of the force is to instill in the cadets' ethos service to fellows, school, firm, and country. Mr. President, the Big C has also affected the recruitment under the cadet program. We've had to move training sessions online, much like the school programs, which have been particularly challenging. Mr. President, we have used the time to to recruit additional trainers so that when schools go back to face-to-face, we have the capacity of adults who are willing to guide our young people to go into the schools to rapidly increase the numbers, which are currently at around 4,269. I believe in this program. I believe it can function as a trigger for better behavior within schools, and better behavior within schools will lead to better behavior within communities, Mr. President. This is a program that the ministry intends to resource appropriately, not just with trainers, but with the support for additional uniforms and for other incentives that include membership. 100. I don't recall, but Mr. President, we have asked the leadership of the cadet force to target some of our most at-risk schools to start the process of bringing discipline in. In many cases, you start admittedly from the first farm space, not because you're ignoring the other spaces, but you want to ensure by the time that first farm cohort reaches the 5th farm, it is a different institution by way of discipline that will give the school administrators more room to focus on the education component. We invite the private sector to partner with us, especially in these schools nearer to some of these bigger businesses, by way of lunch provision for those who participate in the programs and for other incentives. At the end of the day, anybody who has been a cadet, every time I go somewhere and you meet someone who's been a cadet, you hear of the transformative impact that it had in their life. And we believe in this program and we will resource it accordingly as time goes on. I come now to the last major topic that I will focus on, Mr. President, which is the response to COVID-19. I don't see the response as inequitable in the way that Senator Bunting exposed. I have had to sit and face calls from some of the 1% or 10% that Senator Bunting alluded to, who have been quarantined, have been held, have been charged under the DRMA. They have their fair share of the 2,000 charges. And I'm not going to call names on the mic, but I will tell you some after, because I'm not necessarily as popular with some of those as you would imagine. Now, that fact, outside of other decisions, tells me that it has been applied equitably in terms of the enforcement. Now, no policy implementation is perfect. There are always outlier situations. But I know that this government has done everything in its power to ensure that these policies are applied equitably, evenly, and that we do our best to protect lives and livelihoods. Mr. President, this is a constant instruction, and Senator Hill will back me up on this. The Prime Minister holds this dear to his heart. There is no conversation on COVID where he does not discuss the impact on the poor, where he does not insist on the equitable enforcement of these measures, regardless. So I put that on the table, Mr. President, because I see it very, very, very differently than how Senator Bunting would have shared that. There have been any number of spaces, and if we were to go back through, there was a financial institution where senior employees were arrested and charged. There were some very expensive functions held where this has happened. This has happened in a number of spaces, Mr. President. Our memories cannot be that short, not in this chamber. It has been equitably applied. Mr. President, just in final response to colleague Senator Bunting, before I dive into this last section, which won't take too much longer, colleagues, so bear with me. The memory is really, Senator Bunting's memory really is getting shorter. Because well, I won't go there, but memory is getting shorter. Mr. President, I remember a few things which are contrary to what Senator Bunting would have said in his presentation. I remember then opposition leader Dr. Peter Phillips getting up and welcoming the calling of elections. So I don't know where the sudden pushback on elections came, because I know in watching the video, and I can go back and look, I didn't see anybody not banging the desk on the opposition benches at the time. But I'll go back and check to see who was there. You were consistent. Consistently wrong, but consistent. But Mr. President, I retract. But no, but Mr. President, I also recall in July, now opposition leader, former Senator Mark Golding, campaignite, ready strong, but former Senator and now leader of the opposition, Mark Golding, welcoming the relaxed restrictions in July to give businesses a chance to breathe, Mr. President. No, that's not even last year, that's recently, so I know the memory is not that short. What we have not spoken about, Mr. President, is the fact that with a more infectious variant in Delta, you had to give some time for businesses to breathe because you knew stronger restrictions had to come. The variant is 8 times more infectious. You had to let businesses breathe before it was too late for many of them. And we do not. No, but we have let steam out the pipe, you tighten up, because we have always said our policy, you don't have to agree with it, but our policy is to balance lives and livelihoods. And it is why we don't have issues like other Eastern Caribbean countries that have had issues even paying staff. We have managed our economy well, and we've managed the health results well, and we stand by our decisions. You know, some of the titles, you know, anyway. Mr. President.
Okay, thank you. Just about 1:20.
Only 10 more minutes.
Mr. President, it's now approximately 1:20.
It's 1:20 in Hanover.
I said approximately. So now we're asking that my colleagues extend the time beyond 1:20 so the business of the Senate can be completed.
Thank you very much. The question is that the Senate be permitted to sit beyond 1:30 to allow the completion of the business of the day. Those in favor? Minister.
Mr. President, only approximately 10 more minutes. I'll try and keep it short. 10. No problem. No problem. Mr. President, the coronavirus and its associated disease, COVID-19, became a reality in late 2019. The government of Jamaica, led by the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, recognized the potential for devastation and was proactive in our approach to safeguard the people of Jamaica, their lives and livelihoods. The Ministry of National Security was and has been called upon to coordinate the security activities related to the government's comprehensive COVID-19 response by providing enforcement support to the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management in their regulatory role. This became necessary when the Disaster Risk Management Act was activated on March 13th, 2020 with the declaration of Jamaica as a disaster zone. The MNS was also tasked with providing security considerations needed at our air and seaports in an effort to provide a safe environment and reduced opportunities for infection. COVID-19, Mr. President, also had the effect of creating a major disruption in air and sea travel globally, and Jamaica unfortunately was not spared. Mr. President, on the 15th of January 2020, the government of Jamaica announced a travel ban on passengers arriving directly from China, as well as passengers who had been in China within the last 14 days. As a direct consequence of this action, Mr. President, 19 Chinese nationals arriving in Jamaica were denied entry and confined to state-controlled quarantine under the protection and management of the Ministry of National Security. Mr. President, and I'll just remind members, on March 10, 2020, the Ministry of Health and Wellness confirmed Jamaica's first case of COVID-19, and 3 days later, on March 13, the entire island was declared a disaster area in accordance with the DRMA. This was swiftly followed with the quarantining of 7 and 8 Miles Bull Bay for a period of 14 days. The Ministry of National Security, through the Jamaica Constabulary Force and the Jamaica Defence Force, was for the first time during the pandemic called into action to serve, protect, and provide assurance for our citizens in a quarantine bubble. On April 15, Mr. President, the MNS was again called upon to provide similar services for the entire parish of St. Catherine after the BPO cluster. Mr. President, this continued, and I won't go through all of the spaces, but the Ministry of National Security has been called upon and answered the call time and time again to provide the security support for these measures. As is well known, Mr. President, at the time, the ports of entry were closed. I believe it was in March. As is well known, Mr. President, when this was closed, of course, the closure of the ports left thousands of Jamaicans who were outside of our borders when the decision was taken to restrict incoming access. To that end, the Prime Minister announced the formation of a controlled re-entry task force, of which I was tasked with ministerial responsibility. This task force would ultimately call upon the services of the JCF, the JDF, the MOH, PICA, Ports Authority of Jamaica, and the JUTC. In order to facilitate a smooth and orderly process, the Jam COVID web portal was launched. This web portal was used as the official conduit through the Jamaican citizens and visitors alike could apply and gain approval based on a screening process. The Controlled Re-Entry Task Force, utilizing the functions of the Jam COVID web portal, was able to coordinate the return of all Jamaicans who were desirous of returning home and made every effort to get them home because this is in fact their home. Mr. President, through this period, the MNS was called upon to coordinate the safe return of our citizens at various ports of call, including the Norman Manley International Airport, the Sangster International Airport, the Falmouth and Port Royal cruise ship pairs. This was enhanced by the use of GPS tracking to ensure all of our citizens who returned to our shores were observing quarantine orders. This was once again facilitated through the Jam COVID app. Mr. President, we reopened our borders on June 15, 2020 to travelers. Since that period, we have welcomed 219,000 local or resident travelers and 1.152 million non-residential travelers in a safe and effective way, Mr. President, on the back of the work of this committee. Now, one couldn't expect that a year after starting this process, the procedures and systems would be the exact same. Many learnings have been taken and we've made many adjustments. Persons have said, well, where are the dozens of security and health professionals in the space? Much of the process has been digitized. When we started a year ago, people were filling out papers when they were coming off the plane, having put in information before. You're now at the point where your entire travel space, including the health screening, is done digitally, and we sample persons as opposed to having to test every single person. We're now at the point where all the way through to your C5, your entire travel experience in the airport has been digitized. We have increased the temperature monitoring digitally rather than using physical space. I'm sure Senator Allen will recall when some of the greater interest in tourism were having a heart attack because of the crowds backing up in the Montego Bay Airport. The team got in, we looked at all of the eventualities, digitized every part of the process that we could, while still conducting sampling, while ensuring that those who did not answer the questions in a particular way were indeed rejected. We have rejected people from entering the space. The facts remain, and persons say, well, what happened to the quarantine order? Sometimes I know persons, especially those who travel regularly, don't necessarily look back at each thing that they space. You sign a digital quarantine order every time you enter Jamaica. It is signed digitally, and we got the legal clearance. We don't need to have 20 people with clipboards for your signing in that space. You have signed it digitally to board the flights. We had gone through with IATA, that is a standard space. The JAM COVID application approval rather represents a signed quarantine order. Now, persons will say enforcement. A controlled re-entry space versus over 1.3 million people being monitored is a very different process. The country has to decide, with the national security challenges that were outlined at the very beginning, do we use the JCF, the JDF, to monitor locals and foreigners who come in, that they're sticking to the law, or do we sample and continue to pull out those who flagrantly abuse it and charge those in the hope of sending the message? I cannot, in good conscience, reallocate additional security forces to monitoring of those. We do charge people every single week, every single month for breaking quarantine. The capacity to monitor that and the security threats that we have in the 5 to 6 critical police divisions really just isn't there. And I don't think anyone in this chamber will debate the absolute critical need for travelers to deal with our balance of payment issues and our need for foreign exchange, Mr. President. We have done very, very well. I want to also indicate to colleagues in the chamber that as far as South Africa, they use the same systems that we have put in place. It is not limited to Jamaica. The systems that we've used, the approach that we have used, more importantly, has been adopted by other countries and is working successfully. So I, for one, Mr. President, am particularly proud of the work that was done by that working group, because we met every night till late, every single night till late, to ensure that you are monitoring the entry of persons, that you are monitoring the quarantine process, that you are ensuring that Jamaicans received the treatment that they deserve. We had to mobilize hotels and all sorts of things, because clearly those sorts of size quarantine centers don't work. The members of the JDF, the JCF, the MOH, even the JUTC helping where there were other transportation gaps. It was really something to see. It was quite a good example of joined-up government. And I again now extend my own thanks, even though I've done so in the past, to the men and women who worked on this task force, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, as I come to the last program in my presentation, I take particular umbrage to Senator Bunting's remarks about large fast food restaurants. Now, Senator Sinclair, a man from the West, I'm sure you can attest that on the hip strip, pan chicken vendors are open and approved to operate for delivery. And they have bikemen and taximen coming up and carrying pan chicken to persons during lockdown days. I can tell you of pan chicken men who are open in Brayton, in Portmore, and operating, collecting money digitally, bridging the digital divide, bringing them into modern commerce, who are getting bikemen from their community to do deliveries. I can tell you, Red Hills Road has vendors that are open. So, Mr. President, this is an inclusive, equitable program. It is an inclusive, equitable program. Mr. President, it had sold out before. I can tell you some of the pan chicken vendors will tell you that they're selling more pan chicken for delivery than they've ever sold with walk-ins, with walk-bys and drive-ins. Mr. President, the more important win is when the SDC goes into communities and signs up somebody like, I don't remember the name, this guy who does blended juice in front of Kent's, and puts him on ends and he goes into delivery. And then you send him to JBDC and he gets better packaging design and is now moving into the space. There is a silver lining even with matters of this nature. I take great umbrage. It is an inclusive, equitable program, Mr. President, that came at the insistence of the Prime Minister. No, I don't. Mr. President, I go further. I don't know that you have rich and wealthy people as employees in these institutions who are losing shifts because of the non-clinical measures of COVID, Mr. President. It is close to 7,000 workers that we have been able to mobilize safely with limited COVID spread in these spaces that got back shifts and got back work. None of these people are wealthy or rich, Mr. President. And when you talk down about the program that is giving them the work that they desperately need to take care of their families, I take umbrage to it, Mr. President. When I think of the I don't even remember the name of it. There's a chicken restaurant in the Halfway Tree Transport Center. No, man. No. A small little corner space.
Chicken Delight name.
Sorry?
Chicken Delight. Quick Chick.
Interesting, Mr. President. But they're seeing benefits of significant delivery. And what is important, and some of the restaurants will tell you, when you do go to the days where you open back up and things start to feel like normal, they have some residual benefit because persons who have grown used to the comfort of delivery continue. So there's residual benefit, and you start the process of building and formalizing our delivery economy, Mr. President. So it's a program I'm particularly proud of. I just want to make one last point on the ENDS program, Mr. President, because I believe I've established that it is inclusive and equitable. The program, Mr. President, is free. It is a registration portal that allows the appropriate agencies and ministries to approve persons who are compliant in their varying businesses. So, for instance, bikemen who are properly registered and licensed, or food places that have the appropriate food handlers, permits, etc. So this is a program that was for compliant businesses. Businesses that weren't compliant, I know the Transport Authority sent around their bus giving bikemen who wanted to sign up their availability so that they didn't have to go in. I know the public health departments in some of the municipalities went around and ensured that people got their food permits. It is a program for compliant businesses, Mr. President. But there's no registration fee. That's the first thing that I think needs to think. So there's no barrier to entry apart from using the portal to sign up, right? And with the digital penetration that we have, though digital literacy is lower than it is, everybody has somebody that can help them sign up. I have no doubt about that. And based on the numbers of applications, it tells me that the program is working. But beyond that now, Mr. President, there's been a misconception and I think a misunderstanding by many who say ENDS charges. ENDS is a directory. So it is a registration portal, and once you're approved, it becomes a directory. The ENDS program sends you to commercial options. The government of Jamaica has no charge or cost for any person accessing any of the services listed on ENDS. I'm particularly interested and excited to see some of the other services that are now coming in on this space. I can tell you that some bookstores have registered to do delivery of books to students who perhaps would have, because less shopping time, etc., to reduce clustering. Excited about that. I'm excited to report that the RGD will be coming on to facilitate delivery when persons are actually at home to reduce clustering in its auspices. I'm excited that RADA is looking at how to do delivery of farm produce to reduce some of the clustering at some of the farmers' markets while still keeping small farmers engaged. Mr. President, this is a good program. It is a program in line with our policy, our stated policy goal of balancing lives and livelihoods. And it is Mr. President, it is in line with our stated policy objective. It has worked, and we're happy that it is in place. Should we have to, unfortunately, certainly none of us want to, but wherever there needs to be tightening of measures, it gives a curfew management tool that didn't exist before also. Mr. President, some would ask why the ENDS program was under the Ministry of National Security. Because there are different security challenges when the roads are empty. We've had to deploy resources that ensure you have very low, we've really had 1 or 2 incidents in the space. And we had to make sure that we manage that carefully. We also, Mr. President, have to understand that under the DRMA, the exemptions had to come from the Ministry of National Security. Hence the reason the program was anchored with us. But Mr. President, I'm going to agree. And we've taken several off of the road, Senator Morris. I agree with you. But Mr. President, I wish to thank colleagues for extending the courtesy to me and giving me much longer time than I should have been allocated. I hope that colleagues understand some of what the Ministry of National Security is doing to secure our future. I hope they understand our investment program. I hope that certainly the programs and agencies under my stewardship have been explained and have been brought to the fore for colleagues and for the public. Mr. President, the goal of building a safer Jamaica is paramount in the minds of the government. It is the foremost responsibility of any government. There are many more programs that I could bring to the attention of the country that will lead to the achievement of this objective. The time today simply cannot allow. I, however, wish to assure the country that this government, led by the Most Honourable Andrew Holness and supported by the DPM, Dr. Harris Chang, is doing what is required to secure our future. Thank you.
Just before Minister Hill, may I just say to Senator Bunting and Senator Samuda, thank you very much for a very coherent and comprehensive presentation, the both of you. Senator Bunting, I thought your presentation had the quality of a leader. Senator Samuda, I appreciate a very informative presentation. And just by way of a general announcement, equality to speak at length does not extend from meeting to meeting.
Mr. President, I do too want to add my appreciation to both Senate speakers. And I sat there and listened very clearly. And I was also able to ignore certain comments that went about. But, Mr. President, I sat there and listened to the government doing PR and not principled approach to data. Practically every week, some weeks more often than once, the Ministry of Health, the Minister of Health, the CMO, other technical experts, the PS, and the Minister of Health.
Senator Hill.
I believe the occasion is for a motion for adjournment, not a new speech.
I do have a motion, Mr. President, but I must, in good faith, make it clear that the government side on which I speak must respond to the fact that we do give out data and accurate data.
Senator Hill, you have a motion for me?
I have a motion to make. After I make it clear how much I admire Senator Bunting for saying they have and they have not, and accepting what Mr. Seaga set forth, and Mr. Holness is doing very well. Mr. President.
Senator Hill.
Mr. President.
Mr. President. Senator Hill.
Given that the time of the Senate is expired and we've done the business of the Senate, and we will continue the State of the Nation debate at a date to be declared, I now ask that you accept the motion to end the Senate.
Thank you, Senator Hill. The question is that the Senate be adjourned for a date to be fixed. Yes. Members, the question is that the State of the Nation debate be suspended. That's the first question. Those in favor? Against? The second question is that the Senate be adjourned for a date to be fixed. Those in favor? Against?